This story, found in Chapter 5 of Dark Pages Unbound. Sometimes There's Just Evil. Written by Brandon McAleavey. Trigger warning, this story does contain allusions to domestic abuse. This story was inspired by my real-life childhood. When I was young, my mother and I were survivors of an alcoholic and a domestic abuser. However, the supernatural aspects are embellished from things that my childhood imagination thought I experienced. This all happened when I was a child, before my other siblings were born, and back then my mom was a young, single parent. She worked multiple jobs pretty much non-stop to keep us afloat. At the time, we had just been evicted from our current apartment because we couldn't afford it anymore. Since we lived on the edge of financial stability, we were often forced to take whatever opportunity we could get. Luckily, we found an old, out-of-the-way farmhouse no one had lived in for some time. It was cheap, remote, and far from anything resembling civilization, but it was a fine home. The place wasn't abandoned or falling apart, it was just empty. In fact, it was quite well maintained, to be honest. The barn still held cattle and horses, which the farmers who owned the land and the house took care of. Tractors still worked the fields. The whole area was tended to, just not lived in anymore. Now, personally, I thought it was paradise. I had acres to explore. No traffic, no neighbors yelling, no sirens, just nature. It was quiet, safe. The house was enormous, for just two people, at least. A fine kitchen, two decent-sized bedrooms on the first floor, with an attic that had been fully furnished and converted to a third. Not to mention the large, sunlit living room. We moved in during the dead of winter, so I played in the snow for hours without a care in the world. I'd build colonies of snow people, never-ending snow forts, and I'd throw snowballs until my arms were tired. In the summer, since there was no central air, the windows were open quite often. Breezes brought in the scent of grass and wildflowers, and the wind carried with it birdsong during the day, and the symphony of bassy frogs and chirping crickets at night. Most mornings, I'd sit wrapped up in a blanket, watching cartoons, chomping on cereal. Always in the same spot, though the one place where a reliably perfect, cozy beam of sunlight would fall serenely on the floor. What a way to start a day. This was a time before video game proliferation, before cable was affordable, no cell phones, no internet. So imagination was my escape and routine. My daily adventures outside would last until well after the fireflies danced in the fields. When the corn grew tall, I wandered through it like it was a fantasy realm. But that wonderland didn't last. From the start, there were noises. The typical things, clicks, hums, creaks, and groans. Old wiring, old pipes, old house. All explainable and rather typical of an old home. It was the early 80s after all, and the place had already stood for over 50 years, built atop the remains of an even older home from the early settler days or something. Kind of typical for the area, really. One summer morning, I was sitting in my usual sunbeam, warm under my blanket, finishing my cereal. Marshmallows had all been eaten, so it was just the dry, tasteless kibbles that were left floating in the milk. Those bits that just aren't any good on their own, the pieces that aren't worth the effort of chasing around the milk with your spoon. So I softly pushed the bowl with the remaining cereal away. I curled up and tucked my hands inside the blanket, eyes fixed on the TV. That's when a freezing, I guess you'd call it a chill, struck my cheek, sharp and sudden, like ice pressed against my skin. Despite the warmth of the sun and the heat of the room and the coziness of my blanket, my cheek was inexplicably freezing. I rubbed at the spot, but the cold wouldn't leave. It just sort of clung there, numb and prickling. Mystified, I looked around with concern. In my wild, quick turnings, I accidentally kicked my set-aside cereal bowl and upended the discarded thing. Milk and oaty cereal shapes slid across the floor in a not insubstantial puddle. Sighing at the mess I had made, and still confused as to where this focused chill was coming from, I kind of pondered my next move. Before I could act on any decision, my arm, still under the blanket, went just as cold as my cheek. Right at the bicep, too. I bolted out of my blanket and headed for the kitchen to grab a towel. Scared less about the mess I made, but more by the unnatural chill creeping along my body. As I ran, the cold, it just sort of stayed right behind me, clinging to my back. The rest of the house felt a normal temperature, warm even, but that cold, it followed. When I returned to clean the spill, the cold just kind of hovered above me as I wiped the floor, and the moment I finished, it vanished. Like it had never been there. My skin warmed, everything returned to normal. The chills did come back occasionally, not at first, but more and more over time. They always came when I'd done something wrong. A spill, a drop, a break, any sort of mess, like a punishment or a warning. I thought maybe it was an odd guilt response. You know, sometimes your face goes flush and you feel warm, and something like the opposite of that. But I never experienced it before, and no one else seemed to notice. My mom never mentioned it. Maybe she never felt it. She was gone most of the time anyway, working, often coming home well after I went to sleep. Admittedly, I did spend a lot of hours alone in that house. Yes, I was young, but it was a different time then, and babysitters were just another added cost we couldn't afford. You kinda grow up fast when you're poor. The chill, as I often thought of it, was bad enough on its own, but one time in particular, it really upped its game. See, I used to run through the house a lot, with just me and my mom living there in rather Spartan decor and furnishings, because, again, we didn't have much. I kind of had free reign. My mom actually loved hearing me sprint and laugh through the halls. She said it made the place feel alive. One particular day after she just waxed the floors, I discovered how perfectly my socks slid across the surface. I was flying from room to room, building momentum. At the end of one hallway, however, hung a tall, floor-length mirror just outside the bathroom. My mom would often check her outfit or her look for the day before going to work. Anyway, I rounded the corner and launched into a full-speed slide, hoping for my best risky business moment. Admittedly, I hadn't seen the movie at that age, but I'd seen clips of Tom Cruise in his undies and button shirt rocking to Bob Seger's old-time rock and roll. And as I hurtled toward the mirror, I locked eyes with it and froze. For one moment, one brief flash, I saw her. Not my mom, but it kind of looked like some gnarled old woman. Hands on hips, stooped forward. Her scowl was pure loathing, sharp enough to cut joy from any child's heart and put fear into mine. But just as quickly as she appeared, she vanished before my brain could even register more. Where once I was emulating Tom Cruise, my very next impression was that of Scooby-Doo as my feet pedaled, trying to stop my wild careening. I slipped hard and landed on my butt and knocked my head pretty good on the floor. With my momentum, I slid straight into the mirror. It cracked free from the wall and crashed down over me, shattering. Glass was everywhere. My head throbbed from the hit of the floor and the mirror, but all I could feel was cold. A deep, brutal cold. My cheek seized up instantly, numb and stiff. I touched it, half expecting blood, but there was no cut. Then my upper arm went just as frozen, just like last time. So cold, I thought I might have broken it from the fall, maybe? Panicked, I scrambled to grab the broom and the dustpan. But as I swept the shards, I saw her again. In every fragment of broken glass, the old woman stared back at me. Her face was twisted with fury, mouth wide in a silent scream, eyes burning with hatred. I shut my eyes tight for a moment, whispered a shaky count to 3, and then opened them again. Gone. She was gone. Only my pale, frightened reflection stared back. Except where the cold had been, there was a furious, ember-red handprint across my cheek. Not mine. It was too big and long. The thin fingers stretched across the side of my face like a spider. I ran to the bathroom, and it was still there. I took off my shirt and looked at my arm, and my skin bloomed with deep bruises. Finger marks, perfectly spaced, like something had clamped down hard enough to crush bone. I wanted to tell my mom. She was always the only person I could tell anything to, but that time I didn't. Not at first. See, she and I, we were still healing from what we'd escaped. A man who used to hurt us both. He was an alcoholic, and he was angry. He was an abuser. When he'd hit my mom, I'd try to protect her and take the blows for her, even as young as I was. But he'd just violently throw or kick me aside, slamming me into a wall, and then he'd hit her anyway. I must have been all maybe 30 pounds soaking wet. I was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He'd come home drunk and smack me awake in my bed sometimes, or hit me full on just because he could. He'd beat me for nothing other than his own twisted insecurity and asshole male bravado. He told me never to say a word. He'd said it was my fault that he had to hit me. Old habits, good or bad, are sometimes hard to break. So, like then, I just kept quiet, ashamed like it was somehow my fault. When Mom asked me about the bruises, I lied, said it must have happened when the mirror fell. Truth is, I really didn't know where they came from. At least I couldn't explain them. She didn't press. We were building trust in communication, learning to give each other space to speak freely when ready. Freedom to communicate openly is something we hadn't had before. In the situation we lived in, there was always someone listening. Sometimes when you're freed from a cage, the breath and freedom can be just as frightening as the cell. After that experience, I walked on eggshells. I did everything with precision, afraid to make any mistakes. The cold stopped for a few days, maybe even weeks. Hard to recall from that young of an age. And eventually, I felt like maybe the worst had passed. And I told Mom about the cereal, about the creeping chill, the mirror, everything. Even the woman in the shards. She didn't believe the ghostly stuff, not really. But she believed I was trying to be honest, and that mattered. That meant something. We laughed a little after realizing just how silly it all sounded out loud. She kissed my forehead and promised we'd talk more, even about the weird things. That night, I lay in bed. My eyes were wide, mine buzzing because of a great day I'd had. One of the farmers had brought his dog over when he came to work the fields. While he toiled in the field, I played fetch with his dog, and I ate cookies that he brought that his wife had made. Perfect chocolate chip, soft in the center, and just crispy enough around the edges. By the time dusk came, I was worn out, but not enough to fall asleep easily. I was trying to settle when I heard something. Not the insects outside chirping their usual lullabies, or the gentle creaks of the house settling. This was different. It was a voice, I guess, muffled and low, like a deep growl trying to shape itself into words. It didn't come from the hall or even outside. It sounded like it was next to me, but not next to me. You know what I mean? More like it was within the walls, maybe. I froze a little bit. I held my breath. The whispering didn't stop. It scraped and crackled like something was speaking through a gravelly static. Its tone was bitter, angry. I could tell it was male. Furious and frustrated, I knew that tone. The harder I tried to listen, the more distorted it became, like it was purposely denying me any understanding. I did what any kid would do. I dove under the blankets, pulling them tight beneath me, sealing all the edges like a cocoon. I peeked once, just long enough to glimpse the clock. 10:03 p.m. Mom's shift would have ended by now, and she'd be home soon. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew closer and harsher. 20 minutes later, after the constant whispering, the front door opened. I heard the jingle of keys as Mom hung them on the key hook near the door, as she always did, and I bolted. I tore down the dark hall. My skin was prickling and my hair raising the entire distance. I leapt into her arms, trembling and sweat-soaked. Admittedly, Mom jumped, startled, certainly not expecting me to appear out of the darkness when I should be sleeping. But she didn't push me away. She held me. I felt warm and safe. When she asked what was wrong, I just said I had a nightmare. She didn't press. She never did, at least not right away. She walked me back to bed and lay beside me until I drifted off, wrapped in her arms. But the whispers didn't stop with that night. For a week, they returned every night. Eventually, I stopped hiding and I just listened. And when I stopped trying to focus, I began to hear more.
Too much. Ungrateful. Forgive me, Lord. Damn them all.
There was no context, only fragments. Curses spat between prayers, bitter loops of frustration, repeating with varying emphasis and inflection. Then came the footsteps. The house groaned, and then boom, a heavy stomp. Then another. Boots, angry, fast, charging up the attic stairs. Now, the stairs to the attic, they ran just between my bedroom and my mom's. Surely she could hear them too. The bed rattled beneath me as the thunderous steps erupted into a furious, pacing march above me in the attic. Back and forth over my head again and again, sometimes sprinting, sometimes slow and deliberate, but always enraged. And beneath it all, those whispers, now practically in my ear, still not able to understand them, not fully. Of course, I clamped the covers over me again, eyes shut so tightly they ached. When I dared peek out, the footsteps would slam above my head and stay there, pounding as if to drive me into the floor. I didn't try to open my eyes again. I hid away from the terror as only a child can, beneath the magic armor that only a favorite blanket can provide. Eventually, the clamorous cacophony finally ceased, and after all the stress and terror, I quickly passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, I told Mom. I asked if she heard all the racket, why didn't she come running? She looked worried, then asked why I didn't come running to her. I told her of my terrified paralysis, and then she gently suggested it must have been a night terror. I considered that explanation. It was simple, clean, it was easy, it was far less worrying. It made sense, even. Mom didn't hear anything, so it must have been a nightmare. You know how sometimes you can exist on that edge between sleep and awake? Kinda like that. I mean, I've been frightened enough since we've moved here. Who's to say it wasn't informing my nightmares? But the stomping returned, night after night. I just stayed quiet and hid. It worked before. And then every morning, I'd tell Mom. Every morning, she'd suggest nightmares. I could tell she was concerned and sad, stressed for a lot of reasons. But I could also tell she didn't know what to do. She was only in her mid-20s. She was a young mother. She didn't have life figured out either. We couldn't afford to move. She was already working 2 jobs just to afford this place. One morning, after a particularly awful night, she told me she had to get ready for work and went to the bathroom to do her makeup. From the kitchen, I heard her crying. I shouted, "I love you, Mommy. I'm going to play outside," loud enough to pierce the ache between us. Then I went out to my fields and let my imagination take me away to places where I was strong, where I was in control, where I was the hero. I played in my cornfield jungle, imagining my mom smiling at her reflection as she heard my adventures through the open window, pretending everything was fine. That night, however, the house boiled with fury. The stomping began again, louder than ever. This time, I'd had enough. I threw off my covers, ready to run for Mom's room, but the moment I moved, something held me down. Hands. I could feel hands. One on each shoulder, another set gripping my legs, and near my ear, a breathy, urgent, pleading whisper. Then crash! The footsteps stormed down the attic stairs. They barreled through the short hall and stopped outside my bedroom door. I couldn't see anything, and I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it staring at me. A gaze that pierced through the closed, thick, old wooden door, through the darkness, staring with malice at me. The whisper came again, softer but sharper. Then, after a long pause, the angry whispers resumed, fading away as the steps retreated. Only once the angry presence had left did the hands loosen. I pulled the covers back up, crying softly. But now, another sensation crept over me, a gentle warmth, like a soothing touch on my arm, almost protective. I fell asleep to the rustle of corn stalks in the wind. For once, the house made no other sound. Over cereal the next morning, I told my mom about how something strange had comforted me. She listened quietly. When I finished telling my tale, Mom told me she was at a loss for what to do. She felt guilt for leaving me alone at home so often, guilt for not being there to soothe me as I was clearly distressed and hurting. She considered so many options. Moving just wasn't possible at the moment, so she came up with a reasonable solution. Grandma was moving in. Just for a while, she said, to help out, to keep me company while Mom worked. Grandma could use the company too. Then, perfectly naturally, Mom said Grandma would be taking the attic room. The mere mention of that room sent a shiver through me. Of course, I knew the room existed. It's not like I ignored or tried to forget the room. I just didn't actively think about it unless the sounds were happening. And I never went up there. Not before the noises, and never after. For a few quiet days, the house almost felt normal, but it was like it was holding its breath. Then Grandma arrived with a moving truck. I watched as the movers carried box after box up to the attic. I waited for screams, for someone to flee, but nothing happened. I felt like maybe that was a good sign. Grandma settled in. I showed her the land, the animals, my favorite places, even my perfectly warm sunny patch in the living room. The days passed peacefully now. We played board games, we baked cookies, even watched TV. Then small things began to shift. The house, it seemed like it was testing us. First, Mom's keys vanished. When that happened, Mom would take Grandma's car when we couldn't find the keys, so she wouldn't be late. Every day for a week, the keys were gone from the hook, then mysteriously reappeared shortly after she'd leave. Once, they reappeared on the kitchen table, in the spot where I would sit to eat. Another day, they were in my toy box. Then another day in my closet. Now, we laughed at first, but as the pattern implicated me, Mom grew tense. One day, both sets of keys, my mom's and my grandma's, were found under my pillow. Mom was really late for work now, and she snapped. She yelled. I was grounded. No TV, no outside. That day, I watched through the window as the farmer's dog ran joyfully through the fields, while the house groaned around me as if it were laughing. That night, the whispers returned, hissing from the walls like static-soaked muttering. I couldn't understand them still, but they wouldn't stop. I covered my ears, I pulled up my blankets, buried my head in the pillow, but nothing could silence them. I told Mom and Grandma the next day. Mom, still fuming, accused me of lying. She talked about therapy, said we both needed help after everything we'd survived. She hoped we could heal on our own, but she felt like it was time we sought help. Together. Mom went to ready herself from work, and Grandma reached out to comfort me. But I got up and left the table. I ran to the cornfield. My sanctuary was browning. The farmer said he was coming by to harvest soon. My getaway spot would be gone, and I knew I couldn't keep hiding. We'd escaped one horror before. A man, a terrible, evil man. I could face this too. I could face anything. That night, as the whispers crept in, I fought back with song. Nursery rhymes, commercial jingles, pop songs from the radio. It was the 80s, and anything. The whispers grew agitated, snarling and booming. My ears rang and rumbled with a thumping bass of muttering curses. My vision blurred, but I kept humming in defiance. Then the boots started again, heavy, measured, down the attic stairs to my door. I forced myself out of bed, resisting the invisible hands that pressed down on me before. The burning sense of eyes boring through the door, through me, almost made me give in. But rather than crumble, I pushed forward and I ran to the door. I didn't open it, but I stood firmly on my side, right against it. A challenge. The whispered murmurs raged on the other side, angry, garbled, and furious. We stood in a deadlock, and it felt like the entire night passed, though it was nothing more than a 3 count. The whispering thing finally roared and stomped up the stairs where it came from. Then silence. The dark felt darker. The slight chill from the autumn air felt extra cold, and I saw my breath just briefly as I took one deep, exhausted exhale. Crickets chirped again. The moon found me with a gentle light, and I finally slept. Morning came with a hand gripping my ankle. It was gentle at first, then tighter, bonier. As I opened my eyes, there was a harsh tug, as if someone was trying to drag me out of bed by my leg. I grabbed onto the post at the head of my bed and I kicked, but I kicked at nothing. It yanked, and I screamed for my mom. The hand released with a gravelly chuckle and then vanished. I bolted up alone. It was nearly 10 a.m. Grandma was nowhere to be found. Too scared to check the attic, I just waited. I sat in front of the TV, sad that I had missed my comforting sunspot, and I waited. Grandma came down well after 1 p.m. She was pale and slow. "Feeling under the weather, baby. I'm sorry," she said. Then she tousled my hair and returned upstairs. It was out of character for her, and she barely left her room for days. Mom and I talked briefly between work and sleep. Lots of things had changed. The corn was gone, and so was my refuge. And now, other things in the house vanished. Not just keys anymore, shoes, silverware. Mom sighed more than scolded these days and found creative ways to work around the inconveniences. And then the whispers came back. This time, utterly over it all. I just stared at the ceiling and shouted, "Shut up!" The stomps began again with intensity, a sort of finality, and then stopped. Was that all it ever took? Pleased with myself and my bravery, I drifted off. The next morning, soft footsteps paced the attic. I rose to greet Grandma, expecting she was finally feeling better. The steps followed me across the ceiling as I moved from the bed to the door, and then they raced down the stairs. As I reached for the door, the footsteps slammed to a stop just beyond it. I hesitated. There was no sound coming from the other side. I bent down and looked under, that small crack under the door. I looked to see if I could see a shadow, but there was nothing. So I slowly opened the door. I jumped out of my skin when I opened the door wide enough to see Grandma standing there, completely still, her chest rising and falling as if in erratic breathing, her lips stretched in a grotesque grin, drool glistening on her chin. Her eyes stared through me. "Grandma?" I whispered. "Good morning, baby," she said, voice tight between clenched teeth. I just sorta slipped past her, my heart thundering in my chest, and she didn't move. I backed down the hall to the kitchen, keeping an eye on Grandma the whole time. As I crossed the kitchen threshold, I saw her slowly turn and walk to, then up the stairs, into the darkness at the top. No lights. Windows must have been curtained shut. Then she closed the door behind her. As I walked into the kitchen, I saw something fall from the countertop to a waste bin nearby. I looked inside and found a crumpled note atop the waste. Unraveling the crinkled note, I saw Mom's handwriting. "Have a great day with Grandma. I took tomorrow off so we can all reconnect." I felt like the house had tried to hide it. But I smiled to myself and folded it into my pocket like it was a charm, a shield made of affection. Then chaos erupted around me. I heard screeches and crashes from the living room, the sound of furniture being moved and tossed about. I moved close enough to peer into the room. The living room was destroyed. Furniture flipped, TV across the room, photos off the wall and shattered. The whirlwind of chaos made its way through the entire house, room by room. I ducked under the kitchen table, just wanting to get away from it all. Next, the bathroom exploded. Shampoo started pooling on the floor, makeup scattered into the hall. My room wasn't exempt from madness, neither was Mom's. Even the basement. Boxes clattered about from below the floor. Doors around the house slammed, cabinets emptied. I cried and sobbed, wishing Mom would come home, or Grandma would come save me, but not in the same way she was that morning. My eyes had been clamped tightly closed. I hummed songs, and in response, whispers filled the air like 1,000 unseen mouths. The kitchen became a tornado of sound and swirling implements and dishes. Boots stomped above my hiding place beneath the kitchen table, like something was just above me, dancing on the tabletop. I screamed, "Stop!" Everything ceased, and I opened my eyes. It was barely early enough for me to eat my breakfast when this chaos began, but now it was dark, inside and out. Not a single light was on in the house, and I couldn't detect even the slightest bit of starlight. In the still quiet, the front door opened. I ran, expecting it was Mom. A shape loomed in the dark. I clung to its legs, and the familiar, cold chill slapped across my cheek. "Look at this mess!" it shrieked, voice full of loathing. The shade, or whatever it was, grabbed me around my upper arm, squeezing my bicep, and it dragged me through every ruined room. Then it threw me to the floor and dropped a broom beside me. I curled up, sobbing, wishing the looming chill would freeze me solid, finally. Then the attic door creaked open. The cold retreated, and the whispers overtook my hearing. The static layer confusing everything to unrecognition, muffled but furious. I crawled away, cutting myself on the broken dishes and cups. The front door opened once more. "Mom!" I pleaded. A light switch flipped repeatedly, without any illumination. A simple call into the dark stood me bolt upright. "Hello?" the voice called, confused. It was Mom, for sure. I rushed to her, this time with certainty that she was my protector. She wrapped me up and took my hands. She felt blood and knelt in panic and concern. I poured everything out, and she listened. As we were swathed in darkness and dread, she didn't judge. She didn't question. She didn't conjure excuses or explanations. She just listened. Then we heard them. Both of us. Finally. Boots on attic floorboards, thudding toward the stairs. At the bottom, in the dim moonlight, stood Grandma, small and barefoot. Impossible those feet made those sounds. I expected a monster, but it wasn't at all. She stood motionless. Then my mom called up to hers. Grandma charged down the hall and crashed into us. We were all knocked through the still open front door and tumbled down the stone steps. My head cracked hard. Mom hit the ground with a wheeze as Grandma landed atop her, relentless but in a ravaging madness, slapping and hitting my mom. The house erupted. Lights flared, electronics buzzed and shrieked all at once. Static from a radio, TV flickers and emergency alerts blaring, every noise-making toy blasting out their obnoxious sounds. Mom pleaded during her physical struggle with Grandma and begged her to stop. The stars cleared away from my vision, which danced about after bashing my head, and I unsteadily crawled to the battle just feet away from me. Before I could reach them, Grandma's mouth opened wide, and a guttural growl of "Leave" poured from her in a voice that wasn't hers. Mom sobbed. We won't come back." Instant silence fell upon the entire farm as Mom's vow echoed around us. Suddenly, Grandma collapsed, as though she'd been knocked out in a boxing ring. Mom and I cried together as Grandma slowly woke, dazed and completely unaware. Mom led us to the car, no stopping for personal items in the house. She still had her keys in her pocket, after all, since I ran to her before she could hang them up, and we just left in silence, all of us. We found a motel in town, and each of us had a full, deep sleep. The next day, Mom spoke to the farmer. Grandma and I stayed at the motel. He didn't believe any of the supernatural stuff. He told my mom he suspected I was troubled because of what we had gone through before with our abuser, and he thought I'd thrown a tantrum, wrecking the place up. He said she was too young to have kids, called her irresponsible, said she needed a man in her life, and I needed a father. Small town, closed-minded asshole. Personally, I thought we'd do better on our own, despite our recent experiences. Still, he agreed to gather our things for us and have them delivered wherever we end up next. He wanted money to fix the damage, but waived the rent, and we never returned. I never asked questions. I never dug into the house or who lived there before. Never tried to understand what seemed to still live in that house or why it hated us. I didn't really need an answer, because I've come to understand in life, sometimes, like the man who hurt us before, sometimes there is no reason. My mom and I, we weren't broken or bad. We weren't deserving of being hurt. Sometimes people are just evil. Sometimes that's all there is, just evil.
Thank you for listening to Dark Pages Unbound. Story, Sometimes There's Just Evil. Written by Brandon McAleavey. Voices by Brandon McAleavey. Sounds found on freesound.org. Story rights held by the story's author. Please contact Dark Pages Unbound for submissions or suggestions at darkpagesunbound@gmail.com.